So thank you very much that you have today, all of you are with us, and we are going to the second part of our webinar. And today we have a special guest. We have Karsten Wenzlaff, CEO and founder of Institute of Communication and Social Media, a representative of German Crowdfunding Association and Center of Alternative Finance, and expert in tech regulations and policies. Hello, Karsten, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. So today our webinar topic is, of course, regulation, how lives will look like after the November 10, when it will be applied to the crowdfunding service providers. And we would like to discuss and to view your opinion how this application of crowdfunding regulation will change the market within European countries.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that the presentations by your colleagues were fantastic. I think Latvia is really a place which is, very open and innovative, not just for fintechs, but in general for pioneering companies. And I think it's going to be really interesting for many crowdfunding platforms from across Europe to see if they want to get licensed in Latvia and then operate across border. So right now in Europe, we have a very fragmented system of crowdfunding. The national legislation is quite different, and it's not harmonized. And it's even if you have a MiFID license, then still you have to comply with local laws, especially local consumer protection and investor protection laws. And I think the ECSP regulation is going to be really helping platforms to apply a uniform set of rules on the platform and make it easier to move cross-border. And I think this is going to have a tremendous impact on the industry. We already see the first sort of movements in the industry. For instance, we see that platforms are starting to collaborate, doing joint funding rounds for innovative companies. And so even though the ECSP is not in full force yet, the first effects can already be seen in the industry. Then what I think it will also be helpful for the regulators, because right now there are also some regulators which are a little bit more skeptical about alternative finance. And for them, the ECSP regulation is going to give them a clear framework how they have to handle these platforms. And that's going to make it also much easier for the regulators to, to find the right balance between consumer protection and, promoting the industry. And then the last thing, which I think will really have also a big impact, is public authorities collaborating with crowdfunding platforms. We've just done a report for the European Commission together with DG Regio, where we looked at how public funds can be used for co-investment and for credit guarantee schemes. And there's some really early innovative projects going on there, but of course the potential is huge, for public co-investments into, for instance, climate change projects, renewable energies, and all these things. And so I personally think that the ECSPR license is going to allow these public authorities to set up these collaborations much more easily, because they know the other party is licensed, they have certain standards, risk management procedures, and so it will make it much more easier for them to do these kind of collaboration schemes.
Yeah, I think it's a very valuable comment, because now really after the licensing process, when the company will obtain the license, actually everything should be changed. And the attitude from public sector, the attitude from the financial sector, from the investor perspective, as you mentioned, it is quite important. Have you saw any changes on the market, like collaborations between platforms? Will we see kind of consolidation in this area?
Yeah, well, I mean, for the platforms coming from the Baltic states, they were always very quick in internationalizing, because the home markets were maybe too small, and so a lot of the large platforms in the Baltic states have been outgoing at a really early stage of the industry. And so this trend I will continue. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the large platforms as well, but also on smaller platforms. And so I think number one is we will find platforms which are going to be more specific to a certain niche. So they're going to focus on a specific industry and they're going to build their expertise. So for instance, one of our members is a platform which focuses on e-health and health technology. And so this is one example of where actually, the platform, the competition is getting so intense that they have to find a specific niche. On the other hand, I think there will be, especially in real estate crowdfunding, it's going to be a massive attempt to grow in scale. And so I don't know when the first licenses will be given out, but I assume that as soon as the first couple of platforms have this license, the market is really going to shift, because especially real estate crowdfunding is something where economies of scale are quite important. So I do expect, like a big competition between these large platforms to grow into other countries as well and offer their services there. Yeah.
So can we say that we will see the picture that we are currently seeing in the banking sector, when we have the huge universal banks, and we will see probably the huge platforms, like, for example, October, who is specializing in different areas. And then we will see like a small bank, so small platforms that will be specializing, as you mentioned, in real estate, in agriculture sector, transportation, or some specific green energy. So that will be probably the way how them to survive.
Yeah, in green energy, I even think that there's a lot of to be said for platform collaboration. So it will be independent platforms, but for instance, in Germany, we already see collaborations between platforms in Germany and in Austria for renewable energy projects. And those are quite working well. And I expect more of those, for instance, between platforms in Spain and France and the Baltic states and so on. So to do this. And I think here especially the public authorities have a large role to play, because for investors in real estate, it's maybe much easier to understand what's going on, but in renewable energy, it's maybe a little bit more complicated. So we have seen that especially credit guarantees can help to motivate investors to take the step to invest. And so I think the ECSP is going to make these kind of collaborations between platforms much more easier, because then it's also about counterpart risk. Like the platforms know that the other side has to do the same procedures and the same structures internally, and so for them it's much easier than to bring these things together.
Yeah, absolutely. When you are working in one framework, it's you know what to expect.
Yeah.
Exactly. Karsten, how would you evaluate the readiness of the platforms if you look to the current situation in Germany and also on European level, how the platforms are ready for the licensing process? Because, for example, here in Latvia, we see that the platforms are in very different stages. Some of them are only starting to think, okay, so what kind of documents have I to support and to provide? And another one is in more mature level, who is able to understand more deeply the model and already are in a dialogue. What kind of situation you see?
I mean, that's the same in Germany. There's some platforms which already have either a MiFID license or have all the documents ready, and they would probably be able to obtain the ECSP license quite quickly. And then some smaller platforms would probably have to change their internal processes. I think there's a couple of issues which still need to be solved from the platform perspective, and where we are waiting for the RTS from ESMA to be finalized. So one of them, of course, is the licensing procedure itself. It's quite detailed in level 1, as your colleagues explained, but it's going to be interesting how much of the existing documents which the platforms have, they can use to obtain the new license, because there is the provision that if you already have a crowdfunding license in that country or a MiFID license, then it should be easier. But we don't know yet how regulators are going to treat these existing licenses and how much they will allow them to convert this into the new license. For instance, as a practical example, in Germany, we have talked with BaFin about this, and they said they actually want each platform to completely start new with the licensing process, and it's a little bit difficult then because that will cost a lot of money to obtain these documents. So that's one thing. And the second thing I think, which is difficult for platforms right now, is to see how to treat, for instance, existing customers on the platforms. You know, as your colleague said, the platforms have to categorize these investors, have to distinguish between sophisticated and non-sophisticated investors, and the question is really how to put all of these into the new ECSPR regime. So that's the second challenge, and then I think a third challenge will be, and this is relates to the implementation laws. We have seen already that some countries have done a very light implementation law, so it's pretty much taking the level 1 regulation and simply making sure that it works in member states. But some countries are discussing or have already put into force implementation laws which go beyond what the European crowdfunding service provider regime has stipulated. And so this is Germany is one of the cases where we have seen this, unfortunately, and so it's going to be quite interesting to what will happen now. What will be the industry's reaction now if they are going to go to the regulation where it's the easiest to obtain the license, and then those countries where there's a lot of on top, they will maybe have a problem then finding people who want to apply in those countries.
I think it's also for regulators a challenge, because the one thing is like you are creating the easy way to obtain the companies and share the market and open the market. From the other part, it is always a case of how do you control the company if the company is located in a different one. For example, the head office is located in one country and the team is operating. So what would be the best way to perform the supervision? Because if we will see and look from the past experience, we see that there are a lot of risks are around, and probably each regulator also would like to see that at least majority of operation or part of operation is also established in a local market where the company is registered. So for regulators also is a challenge.
I mean, I personally think that for the crowdfunding platforms and the lending platforms, it's a little bit easier than compared to maybe other financial institutions, because the whole platform business is completely digital, and so the platforms have a lot more data which they can offer to the regulator, which shows how they internally assess the risk, how they manage the portfolios, and so there's a lot of data which the regulator can ask for. And at least in Germany, our member platforms, they always have said they want to be very open to the BaFin and explain how risks are being assessed, how KYC is being done, and there's there's nothing to hide on these platforms. They are very open and transparent, and I think the ECSP in itself, from my point of view, is a very well balanced regulation. I mean, it's not completely industry friendly. There's also some provisions which are more difficult for the platforms to meet. So for instance, there's the whole idea about conflict of interest, and that the platform cannot invest in their own project. This is a restriction for the industry, which was coming from the consumer protection side. But I think it's well balanced, because then there's other provisions which are actually quite easy to manage. For instance, I think the potential requirements, that's going to be that's not too difficult. Or for instance, the key investment information scheme, that's going to be really easy for project owners to implement, because it's only 6 pages long, and so it's a short, concise document. And so I think the ECSP in overall is quite well balanced, to protect consumers and to allow the industry to grow.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. And the interesting fact that it is actually brings the transparency in the market that has not been before. And according to the regulation, also it will be much more easier for crowdfunding service provider now, because actually they will not be a subject of AML. and those functions shall be performed by a payment institution or by bank. In this sense, they should actually be fully concentrated on how they are evaluated the risk and how they are interacting with the customer, how they obtain the information about the borrower, and how exactly they are working with key investment information sheet. Is it absolutely correct, and they have to do their job well to obtaining the data from different sources in order to make this high quality 6-page document for the decision.
Yeah.
And for investor also, it should be much more easier to switch, because as we know on the markets, investors are using 4 different kind of platforms simultaneously, and for them it also will be much more easier to understand using the common, let's say not template, but common at least form how the deal is structured. Because today, if we will start to complain, every company and every platform have own ideas how do they are reviewing and describing the deal. Some of them are concentrating on the risk side, some of them are more concentrated on in a business aspect. But one thing that also I wanted to underline during those working with RTS standards, it's interesting that it was also the ESMA's emphasis that actually there should be a lot of attention put it also on the financial part and analysis of the financial and scoring model. And it will be absolutely different standard that how the platforms have to treat the credit risk management, and that is quite serious point for everyone. So they will not be relaxed.
That's true. I mean, I think for digital lending and the credit risk analysis, I mean, I know EBA has put out the consultation there, and it's still work in process. What I see at least in the digital lending spheres in Germany and others is that here most of the platforms tend to work closely with established financial institutions already, and so they provide part of the loan book is actually being even sold to established banks or insurances even, and so on. So I personally think that if the standardization in the credit risk assessment is going to help bringing more transparency into the market. Already the lending platforms are trying to do this. For instance, in France, they have created a standardized way of reporting defaults and losses. And with a new regulation, it's going to be even more clearer, because the way how to report losses and defaults is going to be harmonized across Europe, and that is going to, I think, allow much more industry, like external industry partners, to assess this and then compare platforms, and that will overall increase the transparency in the market.
I think you mentioned a very interesting moment regarding the collaboration between platforms and financial institutions. Because if we will look to the Latvian market, the platforms, I wouldn't say that they are so collaborative, at least for the current stage of the development of the sector. And of course, in Germany, it has been developing for years already. And it will be interesting to see, okay, what kind of steps the market will take and how long does it take in order to jump from the current situation and go through this collaborative environment.
Yeah, I mean, in Germany, the first collaborations are already a few years old, when the banks, when they collaborated with donation-based crowdfunding platforms and used it as a way to show, their social activities, etc. And then in the past years now, we have a couple of banks, I think 4 or 5 banks, which operate their own platform, and they use it to attract private investments alongside with debt instruments, and it works quite well. And I think this will happen much more in the future as well, because for the bank, it's the benefit of the crowdfunding platform is that it's also a little bit of a market test and market communication, and so that's why banks can use how these public offering work and how quick the reactions are from the investors to also assess business models, business cases of innovative companies. So I think so that's where we definitely are going to see much more collaboration, and we are just right now doing a study with the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance as well about COVID-19, and so we often see that especially in the like during the second or first half of the pandemic, there was a big request by SMEs to have more access to finance, and then the banking system in some countries had to go to fintechs and to lending platforms in order to facilitate these finances. So I think that's definitely going to, be. So I don't think this as an opposite anymore. The banking sector and the lending platforms, are they moving so closely together that I think most platforms in the future somehow will have a big established partner as a bank.
I think it will be quite great model for the future, how the platform also could be work in a stable environment and to ensure the funding for the project owners. Because if you are working in some specific area, sometimes it could be quite complicated to get a pool for the project, especially if it requires some infrastructural project or investment project. Of course, when you are working in a current asset funding area, it is much more simpler. But if you are going into the investment project, it is fantastic that you have institutional investor, financial company that is behind the platform, and it will actually straight the industry. And maybe it also should be a message to crowdfunding service providers in order to be stable enough. It is always encouraging to have such a partner. Yeah. If you are going into this collaboration between banks and platforms, as you see on the market, in a lending area, but what about the other area, for example, accounts opening? How the platforms are opening those accounts? Is there any challenges in this area with banks, or you have some specialized banks who are working with a fintech and they have some kind of procedure to treat them and to supervise the risk?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of payment service providers which have the also digital banks which are going to focus on these fintechs, or which already do. There's from one of our members is Lemonway. It's a French payment service platform, and they are quite active with a lot of crowdfunding platforms and allowing them to facilitate all the payments, opening up the accounts. I think that's not so much the challenge there. It's more about, I think, the costs of digital banking on platforms can be quite high for those platforms which are starting. So what I noticed in the market is that a lot of platforms early on, they come to us and say, who are the best business partner for us for a new platform? For the large platforms, they have enough volume to be able to negotiate good rates. But that's for small platforms, that's sometimes a little bit of a challenge. And then another thing which is also quite challenging is sometimes for a platform which has a new business model, which maybe is not the classic crowdfunding model, but for instance tries to combine equity and lending instruments. How do they fit into these different regulatory niches? So in some countries in Europe, you, for instance, have two different regulators, one for the debt instrument and one for equity instruments. And so with the ECSP now, it's going to make it also a little bit easier, because at least for those hybrid models, it's going to be much easier, because they're still under the same framework. They can apply to both. They can do transferable securities or loans, and have similar internal structures. So I think that's also quite positive.
Yeah, exactly. And some platforms that we have been consulting in the Innovation Hub, they also were thinking, shall we apply for the payment institution license simultaneously with the crowdfunding service, in order to think maybe those costs in the initial stage we will cover by ourselves and will be managed. Maybe it will be cheaper. But again, if you are running two companies anyway, you have to allocate the people, you have a staff, you have a lot of business processes to build. And the bigger you will be developed, the bigger you will be, the bigger assets and resources you will be investing into automation of this process. So it will never be a cheap and easy one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is so.
Yeah.
And yeah, another thing that I was thinking, will those crowdfunding service providers will be newcomers or existing one, or this new regulation, will it bring more access or increase the access to finance for SME companies? Will it be more, I don't know, safer or for them to come to such a funding source?
I mean, right now, of course, the volumes are, compared to SME finance in general, are still fairly low. The market is still in an early stage, but we definitely, I personally think this already is increasing the access to finance for SMEs, especially for really small companies, which can use the traditional crowdfunding, reward-based crowdfunding, and then move into the sort of next stages and equity and lending. So that's already happening all over Europe. We have plenty of data and statistics about this. But I think it's also going to be, and also we see this happening not just in Europe, but also when European investors support companies in Africa or Asia, etc., which are also innovative. So we do see this right now. There's some countries which are better in access to finance than others in Europe, which is partially due to the banking system, partially due to the regulation, and so the ECSP is going to push this digital finance a little bit further. But what I do think is it depends a little bit on the sort of the framework which the country is doing besides the regulation. So, for instance, there's some countries which are thinking about combining tax incentives with crowdfunding, or have been doing this already. For instance, if you are doing an equity invest in Germany, for instance, right now, if you are a business angel and you are investing into a startup, you get a certain tax refund. And there is some thinking about whether to extend this to crowdfunding platforms. So if you're using a crowdfunding platform, then you can partially your investment can be tax refunded. So I think this is going to have a big impact as well on how this new mechanism, or I mean, it's not so new, but it's like, it's still young, this mechanism can be adapted by the society at large. But in the Baltic countries, and I think in Latvia especially, the amount per capita is already quite high. So if you look at the statistics of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, then these countries are always at the top internationally on per capita investments. So and Germany is like very at the end or in the middle more. And so I think we have more work to do for us here in these big countries where we still have to explain how crowd investing sometimes works.
Yeah, thank you, Karsten. I have a last question to you regarding the industry in 3-5 years. How do you see this development? What we're actually aiming with this regulation?
Yeah, I think we will definitely have a large growth of the market in general. I think there will be a emerging of platforms. So like certainly, I think in the first 2 years after the ECSP, we will see a lot of platforms coming onto the market. But I think then after 2 or 3 years, I expect a consolidation within the market with mergers, etc., because the economies of scale are just so important. What I also think is the ECSP is going to be used as a template for outside of Europe. When we look at, for instance, the United States or the other countries, Malaysia, which has a really good equity crowdfunding regulation, or Kenya, which has a really good lending regulation, or Indonesia. So those regulations are smaller in terms of the scope. They're not as specific as the European one, but we already see that how the regulation in Europe is being used as a template, as a guidance for these countries as well. And I expect that in 5-6 years, it will be also possible, for instance, to do a crowdfunding campaign for an innovative company in Europe and in the United States at the same time. So I think there will be some alignment internationally as well. But I believe that in Europe we will definitely see a much bigger volume than right now, and a good growth.
Great, fantastic. I also say that the future could be like emergence and consolidation, especially on regulatory level. I mean, in European level, we are more or less be in the same conditions, taking into account some country-specific issues. But again, if the company who is just starting the operation, whatever it would be in Europe or in, as you mentioned, in Asia, for example, and they can predict that actually they are playing in a quite similar legal background, you can so fast to grow, and you can actually have a fantastic scalability opportunities for global environment and global lending business. So thank you very much, Karsten. Thank you for joining the discussion. It was quite interesting. I think your comment will be very valuable and appreciated for the industry professionals. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Lena. Thank you.